Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this program today. A beautiful spring day here in New Jersey, and sadly, a very heavy kind of topic to be talking about. Happy Earth Day to everybody as well. Let's talk a little bit about our program and jump right in. We have an awful lot of content to share with you today, and I'm very glad that you've decided to spend your morning, hopefully, with us as well. Getting some messages here about our chat window. Just opened it for you. And as I said in my chat a moment ago, if you saw it, we'll talk about that in our ground rules in a moment, or our housekeeping rather. We'll be using our chat window as the primary way for all of us to to communicate. Thank you, Amy, for pointing out our chat window issue, and it looks like it's open and working now. So let's jump in, do some of our housekeeping first before we start. As I said, please use the chat window for all kinds of communications with myself and our team, rather than the raise your hands feature or Q&A feature, etc. Good question people usually have in housekeeping right away. When are we getting breaks? We have one formal break built into the program. It is about 10:45 approximately to 11, about a 15-minute break, kind of midway through the program. People ask about a PDF of the slides, and the answer is absolutely. We'll be able to send that out to folks along with a link to a recording of the program, probably over the next several days. So you can keep your note-taking to a minimum this morning and certainly have access to all the information. And you will note that on many of the different slides, we do have citations to the different journal articles, to different textbooks, etc., where we're drawing our information from. If we lose connectivity for any reason with our Zoom, please just stay on the line and give us a moment to reconnect. Not expecting any kind of problems today with the weather being so nice, but you never know. So just hang in there if we lose our connection. Now, as you'd imagine, when we think about something like mass violence, there's obviously going to be speaking about some traumatic events today, some powerful events. If anything I'm sharing with you becomes uncomfortable for you, please take a break. Although we have the one break scheduled, take breaks as you need to, come and go, both for your own physical comfort and for your emotional comfort as well. There's nothing in the program for shock value. Everything has a very clear learning objective. Let's talk a little bit about our objective to begin with. We have expanded a little bit on our topic this morning. And although the primary topic will be the post-incident, post-shooting sort of environment and what is the role of our mental health responders and our different agencies that are involved, we will be talking in the first part of the program today about the role of mental health providers on the front side of these events, a little bit about prevention, and share some new kind of information with you as things are evolving in New Jersey in terms of our efforts to prevent targeted violence. So we have a lot to cover. If we haven't met before, my name is Steve Crimando. I'm the Director of Training for the Disaster and Terrorism Branch in the New Jersey Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services. This is about my 35th year working with New Jersey's disaster and terrorism programs. I'm a certified threat manager with the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals and a certified master trainer with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's National Threat Evaluation and Reporting Program. And I work on New Jersey's statewide threat assessment team and as a cleared mental health partner to the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force in Newark Division. We have two guests today. You'll see me listed as the primary or the lead presenter. We have from also FBI Newark Division, Keila Munoz, who will be speaking to you about the role of the FBI on the post-incident side in terms of victim support and other important work that they do. And you'll hear from Maureen Brogren, who many of you know Maureen as the head of the Traumatic Loss Coalition here in New Jersey. So at the end of the program, they're going to be taking over the screen kind of around noontime to share some real nuts and bolts information about how their programs integrate and interoperate with all the other post-incident sort of supports and services that are brought to bear here in New Jersey in a post-mass violence way. This is kind of the ideal month, unfortunately, for doing a topic like this. In Homeland Security circles, this is the month we're always kind of most concerned about in terms of potential copycat and contagion events when we think about mass violence. And historically, a number of events And I do mean historically, like way back to the Boston or the first shots in the Revolution in Lexington and Concord back in 1776. We see, a just trail of different events that have been motivated in some way by patriotism, motivated in some way simply by copycats that they've banked on other events. These go back to, as I said, the siege at Waco, the Oklahoma City bombing, which is a major anniversary this year, certainly Columbine, high school attack, and many others as well. So as you see in the graphic, we have had many, many copycat sort of events around the United States in April to be timed with things like the Columbine high school attack. And again, you remember Columbine was timed against other major events. So all of these kind of, in some ways, have piggybacked from each other. So a very important month for us to be thinking about really mass violence, both in prevention and response. So we're actually going to start on the prevention side for a good part of our morning. And as I said, even though some of you may be very expert in this already, it's an emerging field. There's a lot going on in New Jersey. There's a lot going on in the US. There's a lot going on internationally in the science around understanding the prevention of targeted violence. And I'll explain that terminology a little more to you as we go into our program this morning. When we today use the term mass violence, it will encompass a wide range of different sorts of events. And you see these kind of listed in our points here, from mass shootings to bombings to vehicular attacks, collective violence like rioting, hijacking events, the more exotic events we'll call CBRN, or chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear sorts of terrorism or extremism. We will not, though, be talking about war or genocide. Obviously, those are a form of mass violence, but they're not what we're going to define as targeted violence today, which will really be kind of at the center of our discussion. When we think about our response to mass violence, as I said, increasingly, there is a role for all kinds of mental health professionals on the front side of these events in prevention. We have a number of people on our call today, I see, from our screening centers and our crisis units, always involved in prevention of violence and dangerousness. Today, we're going to introduce some different concepts for everyone in our audience about how targeted violence is different, look at the pathway to that kind of violence. And then, of course, we're going to turn a critical corner during the program where we start talking about the post-incident environment and what is the role of mental health professionals there. When we think about this, there's two key focal points that we share, and that is that the human response to disasters and terrorism is both hazard specific and it is phase specific. And what we mean by hazard specific is people obviously do not react the same way to a mass shooting event as they do to a bioterror event, as they do to a vehicle ramming event. There are variations of these responses that we have to accommodate for, we have to understand to serve people well. On the same kind of thing or theme, we talk about the phase-specific response. And really, I know everyone here has observed how people react. And hour one is different than day one, week one, month one, year one, and so on. So our interventions or support have to also be phase specific. They have to be, again, appropriate to the phase of the scenario. When we get into the content a little later this morning about the post-incident environment, we're going to work along those timelines from directly, the act of violence to the minutes after, the hours after, the days after, and speak very specifically about the role of our responders, our mental health responders in this. Now, you have to understand in New Jersey, our work in the disaster and terrorism branch and our work in post-disaster, post-terrorism mental health is, of course, highly integrated with all the other emergency response functions. And if for any of you who have ever been deployed with us as DRCCs, disaster response crisis counselors, you may remember wearing our vests that simultaneously have the logo of the disaster and terrorism branch, which you see in the lower left corner of the slides, but you also have the logo of the New Jersey State Police Office of Emergency Management. And we're working under their auspices when we're just, really deployed to these large scenes. And this calls for a very, very high degree of interoperability of our systems, our plans, really, again, our skill sets, et cetera. And we'll talk more about that as we go. We'll talk, about some of the logistics of how we deploy, where we deploy, the sort of skills we would use in the post-mass violence environment. But we're going to start with the most fundamental concept. And this is, if you've been with me before in training, where I start pretty much every one of our programs, and that's with Lewin's equation. And Dr. Kurt Lewin, of course, thought to be the father of social psychology, had famously said that human behavior is a function of the interaction between a person or a group and their environment. I want you for a moment to think about our environment. And even though I welcomed you with a happy Earth Day sort of welcoming this morning, I'm not speaking just about the physical environment. I'm talking about the social environment, the economic environment, the media, the political environment, et cetera. We are in a whirlwind of a time, really with so much going on, both here in the States and abroad. It is a very dynamic, a very complex environment, and a lot of people are on edge. Easy to say. The most recent Stress in America survey done by the APA, American Psychological Association, tells us that about 50% of US adults surveyed said they actually felt numb from the level of stress that they're encountering each day. About 58% saying they felt overwhelmed on a daily basis by their stress level, and 68% feeling less tolerant with other people around them due to their current levels of stress. People, as I said, are on edge. And we know that stress does really contribute to a number of different things, including rates of violence. I can never keep slides like this updated enough. Obviously, since I created this slide, which was this time last week, we've since had the shooting event at Florida State University, the tragedy there. And so these numbers obviously, have gone up so significantly since then. There are a number of different sources of statistics and information about mass shooting. We can look at FBI statistics, which usually track active shooters, and that number tends to be lower because the definition used by the FBI is more specific and narrow. If we look at information from the gun violence data archives, the numbers tend to look much higher. But when we look at mass shooter tracker right now, we see that last week at least, we were up to 98 mass shootings so far for the calendar year. And sadly, that starts to work out to pretty closely like, one a day in many instances. This, unfortunately, mass violence has become a reality in American life. If you have children in school or had children in school, certainly we know that no one goes to any level of school today without rehearsal and preparation and instruction on how to respond in an active shooter or an active assailant event. And we understand the importance of this because what we've learned the hard way is there's no place that's immune from this sort of violence, whether it's entertainment venues, concerts or movies, it's houses of worship, it's shopping arenas, it's workplaces, it's schools, of course. We have to be at some level of preparedness for mass violence in all settings we go to. Having said that, then, what we are thinking is that we as systems also need to be always prepared for the possibility of mass violence. And I knock on wood, I hate to even say that out loud, because at any moment, our phones could go off, et cetera, and we become aware of something that we may need to be a responder to. So this is unfortunately the trend. This is unfortunately where we are today, that there are, this prevalence of mass violent events around the country that require our constant vigilance and our constant readiness to respond. Now, if we look, for example, and I'm going to be very sensitive, I hope, and smart about how we talk about these next several slides. And remember, you do have access to a PDF of these slides as well after the program. This from the FBI pre-attack behavior study done in 2018, we see that mental health stressors, and this is what you should take away from this slide, mental health stressors in this study of 63 incidents were the number one contributing factor. And here we have to separate contributing versus causal. Nowhere in the literature are we suggesting that mental health issues or mental health diagnoses are the causal factor in these shootings, but we understand they are a contributing factor. But more importantly, is not the term here mental illness. It is mental health stressors. And this is much more a question of people's mental wellness than necessarily mental illness. All of the research, beginning with the landmark study in this area known as the MacArthur study, came down essentially in the same place, which is to say that people with mental illnesses are no more likely to be violent than the average person. In fact, they're more likely to be the victims of mass violence than the perpetrators of mass violence. But we do see mental health concerns and sometimes mental illnesses as a factor in many of these instances, many of these cases. And we know, as I said, we can look at this as a contributing factor. Now, as we think about that, and you go back one or two slides where I was talking about people's current level of stress, we also know that the prevalence of mental illness has shifted, has changed in the pandemic and the post-pandemic era. If we were having this discussion, say in May, or March of 2020, right at the onset of the pandemic, I would have said to you at that time, the prevalence of mental illness in the United States is about 1 in 5. It was 18.6% of the adult population at that time. And today, it is thought to be 1 in 4, 26.4% as shared by Johns Hopkins. So if we look around our environments, home, work, school, shopping center, we have to make the informed assumption that roughly a quarter of all the people we encounter are struggling in some way with mental health issues. And we've, kind of laid out the case already, or at least started to, that these mental health concerns can contribute to the rates of and the risk of what we're going to call targeted violence. So we have a number of trends in play. One that concerns many of you who are online today, who are children's specialists, work with the TLC, work in screening center where we could see children and adolescents as well, or in your private practices and such. Increasingly common to see mental illnesses present in younger people. There's a lot of different talk and theories about why. And you've heard some of them over the last year, ranging from, screen time and smartphones to, social isolation and loneliness, all potential contributing factors. Hard to root out, how to know exactly the how and the why. But we do see rates of mental illness are rising fastest in the young adult population, about 18 to 25. And if you think back to many of the mass shootings, especially those that have happened on college campuses, this has been a real age bracket of concern. And you will know clinically, certainly this is also the age of onset for many of the different major mental health conditions. But we think the pandemic greatly exacerbated youth mental health concerns due to changes in schooling, changes in social isolation, more time online, things of this nature. Now, I made this statement before, and I want to kind of reiterate it, which was, the research in this area tells us that people with mental illnesses are no more likely to be violent than the average individual. And the exception to this, or at least one of the exceptions to this, is the idea, and this again comes from the MacArthur study, that if someone does have a diagnosis, and yes, it does depend on what sort of diagnosis, but also is non-compliant with treatment and medication and gets involved with substance abuse, this kind of triangle is the sort of thing that greatly escalates, potentially by a factor of 5, can escalate the likelihood of violence. So it is not just the presence of a mental illness. It typically is the presence of mental illness in combination with other sorts of features. So what we start to learn is we're looking at this topic today through the lens of what we refer to as operational psychology. And operational psychology can be best understood as the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological ideas for their tactical or their operational value. So as we're looking at scenarios and we see these markers, it raises our concerns about risk, about potential violence. So it is not just having a mental illness, but as I said, mental illness in combination. And this leads us, as we talk about targeted violence, which we will define more specifically over the next few slides, as not someone who just snaps. All of us are familiar, I would imagine, with the expression, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And that implies, obviously, that things have been building up for quite some time to a tipping point where something just gives. And as we look at targeted violence more specifically over the next several slides, we see that that's typically the case. And the research bears this out, as we'll share and we'll discuss in the next several moments. Individuals who commit targeted violence, active shooters, and you'll notice a term I'm using fairly interchangeably today, which is active assailant. An active assailant is a term that's just meant to be broader, to incorporate the possibility of any type of weapon, not necessarily just a firearm, which obviously would be implicated in an active shooter scenario, but any kind of mass violence that we're going to go on to describe as being targeted violence. So in this way, we know that people move through a process towards this sort of violence. It is something that's very different. As per the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, targeted violence, the key feature here is the premeditated aspect of it, whether it's targeting an individual, a group, a location, regardless of the motivation. It is this act of violence that has been methodically thought through and planned for, and we know it's actually something different than many other forms of violence. It's what we would refer to as predatory violence as opposed to affective violence. Affective violence is someone losing control. Predatory violence is someone taking control. If we think about affective violence, this emotionally driven violence, probably the easiest scenario to think of is something like road rage. And here, some other driver thinks that you cut them off in traffic, you took their very special parking spot at the shopping center, whatever it is that has gotten under their skin, and this person just loses it. They're yelling and screaming and cussing, and we have this elevation of ANS, autonomic nervous system. So the veins are bulging in their forehead and they're flushed perhaps. And as I said, heart rate, blood pressure elevation is all elevated as they react to their anger about the situation. Whether it's through security cameras, eyewitness report, or increasingly common of attackers filming and broadcasting the attacks in real time, kind of streaming these attacks. We know when we watch acts of predatory violence, the actor is cool, calm, collected, methodical. They are sometimes talking through the event. They are not losing control. They're not yelling, screaming, cussing. They are not out of control. They are moving very, very purposely. This has an absence of that ANS, autonomic nervous system arousal. It is something very different. What we have learned over time is individuals who do commit targeted violence move along a particular pathway. Now, there is some very interesting underlying neuroscience. And if you're into this kind of stuff, I'm going to recommend a great book for you, especially that we're coming towards the summer months, which is The Anatomy of Violence. And the reason I mention the summer months is if you leave this book on your towel or your chair down at the beach or at the pool, no one will sit next to you and you'll have all the privacy that you need. These images here are from the Stanford University brain scan study, 40 years, 50 years now in the making. And what you see on the towards the left side of the screen is hopefully you and I, control group, someone you consider as normal, at rest. This is at rest. Now, the top of the slide, that's the prefrontal parts of our brain. That's higher executive function, right? So it's problem-solving, decision-making, logic, reasoning, verbal processing, all those higher kind of cognitive functions. And the bottom of the slide, bottom of the skull image, is the brain stem. And that regulates, of course, all of those vital signs I referred to as ANS. And in that same region, very close to the limbic system that regulates emotion. Now, if we go to the other side of this slide, to the right end of the slide, this is you and I provoked to anger. And this is what's done in the laboratory known as a Stroop test. And what you see in this is, although we're still in the doing mode, our brain stem is still very active. The front of the brain, the thinking part of the brain, more or less goes dark, right? So lights are on, no one's home sort of thing. We are not thinking anymore. We are just reacting. The problem is in the center of this slide, if we look at that predator and we use the same laboratory test, the same Stroop test to move them towards aggression and violence, that the front of the brain is still lit up They look very much like anybody else. Probably even more of the brain is active. This is someone who is not losing control. They are on their game. They are in their zone, functioning as really as effectively and efficiently as they can. So the predator at a neuroscience level actually seems to be wired different than you and I. Now, here's another way to look at it we would think is really interesting. And this will tie into our discussion of targeted violence more in the pathway to violence over the next several slides. This study looks at a very specific part of the brain that's involved when individuals are thinking, planning, fantasizing about what we're going to call altruistic punishment. Now, I'm going to give you a heads up. I didn't do this in our introductory slides, and maybe I should have. In our world of threat assessment and speaking about targeted violence, there is a kind of a philosophy that we shouldn't use the names or the images of past shooters as a way to deprive them of their, maybe they're seeking fame or notoriety. And I get that, and I agree with that, but I'm not going to do that. And the reason I'm not going to do that is because when I speak to an audience like yourselves, a very, again, professional, sophisticated audience, the names of these attackers, and sometimes their images as well, are actually meaningful pre-incident indicators. What you'll see over some of the next slides is a well-established commonality amongst these attackers to be fascinated with and study other previous attackers. In this way, then, if we have an individual we're working with who is talking about Elliot Rodger in Isla Vista, California, or Anders Breivik in Norway, just the fact that they know of these people, that they perhaps have been studying about them, maybe they idolize them, maybe they are seeking to emulate them, all should raise our level of concern. So we are going to use names and images of attackers for a very specific reason in a closed session like we have today. Now, having said that, we come back to this slide and we come back to the nucleus accumbens. Here again, you see is related to the pleasure reward system of the brain. Altruistic punishment, let's use, for example, what we know of Luigi Mangione and his attack on U.S. Health or United Healthcare executive Brian Thompson in New York several months ago. In the writings that have been released, we see statements from Mangione that say things like these folks are parasites, referring to these two insurance executives, and they had this coming. That's an idea of altruistic punishment. We are conducting this violence because it's in kind of the greater public interest. When people fantasize about that, and you'll understand the role of ideation and fantasy in just a few moments, it activates this part of the brain, part of the pleasure reward system that actually kind of feeds and motivates the person further to continue that thinking and maybe even advance that thinking. So there's some very, very interesting sort of research about the brains of individuals, the neurologic sort of aspects of this that are emerging as our science, our neuroimagery becomes more sophisticated. Now, let me give you an example of that. If you think about school shootings, how many over the years, how many of these incidents do you hear, especially after school events, that the individual was a loner, right? We've heard that so many times. When you look at this more closely, it tends to be that the person was not necessarily a loner, of someone whose temperament, whose desire was to be alone. It was more of what we refer to as an incompetent joiner. And the incompetent joiner, let's make this about like a school age scenario, is that kid who wants to sit at the cool kid lunch table, wants to go to the dance, wants to get the date, wants to, again, be part of the cool kid circle, but gets pushed away. Maybe they're a little bit socially awkward, get pushed away, leaves feeling rejected, leaves feeling maybe humiliated, feeling hurt. When they have struck back historically, the kids who we hear bullying perhaps was a motive, it tends to be that revenge or retaliation against people who they believe have hurt them, that kind of justified altruistic violence. For many of you, being alone is your happy place. In fact, if you could have an extra 15 minutes of quiet time each day, it would probably greatly reduce the likelihood of you killing somebody. But these individuals are not necessarily loners. They want to be connected, but they have a difficult time, and maybe they leave feeling humiliated. Now, this is relatively new research. I want to introduce it to you this morning if you're not familiar. Michelle asks an interesting question about CTE, about traumatic events and injury to the brain and such. And certainly there are interesting correlations there too as well. But the work we looked at from the book The Anatomy of Violence, Adrian Rain's work, was primarily about the natural state, not in a damaged state. So let's go back to humiliation. This is the work of some of our colleagues at the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, Dr. Carrie Gibson, Andre Simmons, and a number of other folks we work with there, who have found that when we look at individuals who've been on a pathway to violence, to this sort of targeted violence, those individuals who've experienced humiliation are actually 4 times more likely to execute the violence. So what we have seen from this is the emergence of a series of specific questions that we ask in threat assessment now, behavioral threat assessment and management, to kind of screen for humiliation as a motivating factor in some of these instances. So we're learning more and more about that. If you work in the schools, if you work in the screening center, if you're listening to people's stories about maybe violent themes or violent thoughts, we should be listening more and more as I said, for themes of humiliation. Again, going back to the FBI pre-attack behavior study in 2018, we see that real or perceived, we see that the individual feels they have been hurt. And Kevin brings up this idea that, in the postal shooting and a number of shootings over years, we've seen this motive, this humiliation as being so central. People feeling, and think now, and again, we're going to present today in the most politically agnostic way we can, at least I can, about just the number of layoffs happening around the country, whether you agree with the layoffs or not, in government and private sector and so forth. Lots of people are losing their jobs right now. So the perception of an adverse interpersonal action, of an academic action, of an employment action, these are the kind of things that not just affect people as a loss, but also in many instances they experience as humiliation. But this now becomes a very important word in our language for this morning on the pre-incident side of scenarios, and that's the idea of grievance. Because what we understand is in the dominant model of targeted violence we use today, which is known as the pathway to intended violence, we see grievance is the entry point to this. So we look at 2 pre-operational phases, which mean before people start moving towards action. And the first is to formulate some sort of grievance, real or perceived. And there have been instances, cases we've worked on, cases we've studied, in which the grievance wasn't well-founded. It might have even been delusional in some instances, if psychosis was part of the story. But the individual believes they have been hurt in some way. They feel that there's something being done wrong to them or others that motivates their anger. Now, the good news is, if it is good news, there are many people walking around each day with a grievance, and maybe you're one of them. And the good news of that, as I said, is the vast majority of people with grievances never go any further than that. They mumble and grumble, and they kind of just, I guess, marinate sometimes in their anger and frustration about things. And there's a subset of those people who go to that next level and start to form violent ideations. They start to think about the thing they would do to retaliate or get revenge or set something right. And again, the good news here is the vast majority of people who move on even to ideation don't go any further. They'll just kind of entertain those fantasies when they're all worked up and kind of stay in that pre-operational mode. But things start to get much more dangerous when they move into the next phases, which we're going to call operational, planning, preparing, etc., as they move into or move towards action. Now, a few things about this model, which was first developed in 2003 by Calhoun and Weston, and now adopted by Homeland Security as I said, the primary model. Kim asks, we will be sharing the slides and recording. probably within a few days after this. So you'll have access to all these materials, Kim. One of the key points about the model is people do not always move in an absolute linear and sequential way along the model. They could skip steps and they could backtrack. What you should think about these more as milestones on the way to an attack. Did a person pass these different sorts of places? So I want to give you a scenario, again, breaking the rule about using names and images of shooters. James Holmes, who was the attacker in Aurora, Colorado, you may remember this in 2012, the shooting at the midnight premiere of one of the Batman movies. His grievance really was based in him being acutely mentally ill. He was a PhD neuroscience student at the University of Colorado, and everyone recognized that this guy was struggling academically. He was struggling financially, he was struggling socially to such a degree. His professors, fellow students were really concerned, some afraid of him, and he was put out of class until he got proper kind of mental health attention. And so he's seeing a therapist on campus, and in fact gives the therapist what has come to be called the spiral notebook, where he's drawn out the whole storyboard, the whole attack plan. And duty to warn, she does the right thing. She notifies campus police. But if you look at the spiral notebook, you'll see that he's drawn that the movie theater he intends to attack is next to a shopping mall. It's not on campus at all. The crack here that everything falls through is campus police never notified community police. Well, if we look at James Holmes, he starts to foment primarily as a byproduct of his psychosis, this violent ideation about attacking the movie theater. He starts going to the theater over and over again, day and night, watching shows, always sitting in the cheap seats, the last guy to leave every time there's a movie. After the patrons leave, the staff has swept up all the popcorn. He's still sitting there watching and making notes for himself. In the meantime, besides this kind of hostile surveillance, he's spent an awful lot of money, as you'll see in several slides from now, acquiring weapons, body armor, explosive materials for this attack, preparing and moving towards this, training at the range, booby-trapping his apartment. And as much as he's kind of actively psychotic, he still is functional enough to execute and put this whole plan together. Last phases on this, we see him on the day of the attack go to an afternoon show. Like usual, watches the movie from up in the cheap seats. He's the last guy to leave, and this time he leaves through the back door, an emergency exit, which he props open with a rock. When he comes back for the midnight show, dressed in full body armor, full tactical gear, carrying a long gun, comes in through that back door where no one will notice him. The movie's on, screaming and blasting and all the special effects in the movie, walks right to the front of the theater and just cuts loose. So here we can take a case like that, lay this template over it, and see this very steady progression along this pathway. Now, as I said, this is violence that's different. It's not serial crimes. It's not spree killings. It's not gang-related killings. It's something very, very different. And what we've learned is that this model fits pretty tightly for most of these instances. When we think about the role of mental health providers in targeted violence, a lot of our discussion, as I said, and as advertised, will be on the post-incident side of the coin this morning and through our program today. But there's increasingly an important role in all mental health professionals in recognizing when an individual may be on a pathway to this sort of violence, understanding what these behaviors mean and how to refer an individual like this to get not just the right level of care, but the right level of involvement with the system that could create an off-ramp, as it were, and reduce the likelihood. When we look at this model of targeted violence, it is part of really, again, an approach today that's referred to as BTAM, or Behavioral Threat Assessment and Management. Those are two different concerns. Behavioral threat assessment is a question. Do we have a problem, and how big and bad of a problem do we have? We're going to call that level of concern. And then the second question is threat management. What do we do about that level of problem that's appropriate, that's proportional, that's respectful, that doesn't create more grievances, but does make the situation safe? What we've learned is that this kind of threat assessment is the complete opposite of profiling. Profiling is an inductive process. threat assessment is a deductive process, but there are important commonalities. Whether we're looking at Jared Loughner on the left end of the screen, the shooter of Congressman Giffords in Arizona, James Holmes, the Aurora, Colorado attacker we mentioned a moment ago, or Adam Lanza, as you look at these stories, as you look at the individuals, things really jump out at you as being commonalities. Some have to do with gender because these are primarily male endeavors, still about 95% male, roughly. We have had this calendar year several female shooters, younger female shooters. So this is gender neutral, but it is more likely to be perpetrated by males. And if you look at this graphic again by the FBI, you see two spikes in age. One, as I mentioned, in young adulthood, and the other is kind of in midlife. And if you think about many of our attackers, they tend to be more likely in these age ranges. But our youngest, hey, you remember seeing a case a year ago of a 6-year-old in the Virginia classroom who shot a teacher. We saw the attack at the Holocaust Museum in D.C. that was a gentleman, and using that loosely, of course, in his upper 80s. So the whole lifespan is potentially or particularly implicated here. But there are, as I said, important commonalities. And this is away from profiling, as I said, because what we've learned from profiling in this area is it yields too many false positives to be effective. We would end up arresting, detaining, hospitalizing way too many people who perhaps, in fact, did not represent a risk of targeted violence. The landmark study in this area was done by, or funded at least, by the Justice Department and the National Institute for Justice, and it's known as the Violence Project. And there's a good hardcover book out in the stores now that's by the same title that goes into great depth about the research. Two important things come out of this study. The first is, as I said, there's no clear profile of an individual who is likely to be on this sort of pathway to targeted violence. The second is that there are four other important areas of overlap. The first of these, and probably not surprising to you, and I apologize for a little bit of a typo in the first line here, that individuals who go on to commit this very likely were exposed to ACEs, adverse childhood events or traumatic events as children that really shaped them in many ways. And this could be violence in the home. It could be suicide of a parent or a sibling. It could be substance abuse. It could be, abuse and neglect in different ways. Things, again, that affect their childhood and probably affected child development to some degree. The second is that practically every mass shooter studied had some sort of tipping point or identifiable crisis point in the weeks, months leading up to the shooting event. So as we are looking at the big life story of the individual, knowing what the near term has looked like, looking at the last several months, becomes very meaningful. The third of these I mentioned earlier is that most shooters are obsessed with other shooters. So if we look, for example, as the Connecticut State Police were able to get into the bedroom of Adam Lanza after the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting, a virtual shrine, a veritable shrine that he built there, studying, again, meticulously, worshiping to some degree, other shooters. And probably kind of obvious to us is the idea that the shooters had the ability, they had the skill, the will, and the access to the weapons to be able to execute on their plans. Now, something different and one thing that's changed slightly here in the state and also around the country is that the thing that hasn't changed, I'll start with first. Most of these weapons are legally owned. If it's a younger person who commits this violence, the weapons are usually owned by family, friends. If we look at the case last week in Florida, the weapon was owned by the individual's mom, who had been a sheriff's officer, or I believe still is a sheriff's officer, and somehow had access to that weapon. So it's owned by family members, friends, neighbors, in some way where a person can get their hands on them. And if it's a person over 18, in many instances, those weapons were legally purchased. But we have a newer thing, again, around the country, and that's the development of ghost guns. We have so many young people who are technologically savvy. We have places where in homes and schools, people have access to 3D printers where you can create either entirely or the major components of different firearms. And of course, the thing that makes it a ghost gun is it doesn't have any sort of serial number registration, and there's no record of the weapon being purchased. So very often, even searches of databases are not going to yield that the person may have access to a weapon. So these are the four commonalities. Again, none of them should be necessarily surprising or shocking to us, but we know that, again, if you look at these, they really bring up a very, very wide range of what we could look at as being potential contributors or potential pre-incident indicators of violence, very specifically this sort of targeted violence. Now, again, I know there's a lot of action on many of these slides. Remember, you are going to get a PDF of these slides, so we're not going to linger on any one too long. But I also want to talk to you today. And this is like, I hope this is interesting and useful to you. It's very important to me to be able to share this with you today because things are changing. Over just the last several months, the FBI has developed kind of a newer, the latest designation of domestic violent extremists that we're referring to as violent ideological nihilism. Now, nihilism, as I said, is the belief in kind of nothing, right? And it sounds like a contradiction, an oxymoron. Ideology is a deep belief in something, and nihilism is a deep belief in nothing. So they feel like they kind of contradict. But this is a very misanthropic sort of viewpoint, and it's becoming increasingly common in younger people right now. You're familiar with philanthropy, the love of humanity, misanthropy, the hatred of humanity. And going back in millennia, the idea of nihilism is a viewpoint that the popular beliefs in a culture or worldview, excuse me, is completely useless and senseless. There's no purpose in life. There's no meaning in life. There's nothing good in life. And if you're going to do anything at all with your time on earth, the only thing of true value you could do is to be destructive, as destructive. This is violence for the sake of violence, as opposed to any other sort of attachment to a religious, political or other ideology. This is a deep belief in just the meaninglessness of life and the importance of creating chaos and destruction. Here, if you're familiar with the idea of the pills, these are not actual pills, but metaphorically, again, taken from the Matrix movie franchise, the red pill, the blue pill, the black pill kind of representing this apocalyptic nihilistic view. And in online virtual communities that exist in subreddits, that exist in Discord servers, places like this, increasingly we have younger people populating these virtual communities who adhere to this nihilistic sort of thinking and again desensitizing themselves to a lot of really, really harsh content and conversation, making them more likely to embark on this sort of violence. The virtual communities have become tremendously important. Now, I said this in my introduction of myself. This is my 35th year with the state. When I started in the late 1980s, the primary way that people were radicalized towards violent ideologies was a very simple system known as I met a guy. I met a guy at work. I met a guy at the bowling alley. He told me about his views. I thought they were a little bit wacky. Gave me a brochure, gave me a cassette tape. I listened to a sermon. I listened to a lecture. I started to really identify with some of this stuff. So I went to some of his meetings, met some of his friends, and you see the slippery slope where people become kind of indoctrinated and radicalized into a belief system. Today, it all happens online. It happens 24/7 in the privacy of your home where people are introduced to this way of thinking. And increasingly, people join others with similar thoughts in what we're referring to here as virtual communities. In these communities, the themes are very often very self-deprecating. They are fanning the flames of both suicide and homicide, of this destruction of society. They're sharing of very, very graphic, violent content, things like beheading videos and kind of snuff videos and gore videos, things of this nature. Really, really toxic stuff. Again, that if nothing else desensitizes the participant to this kind of really rough stuff. In these communities, we talked before about the loner and the idea of the incompetent joiner. These individuals who are otherwise isolated, home alone on their computers, phones, tablets, etc., are alone together. This is something they share. They join these virtual communities, And the messages are just very, very hateful, self-loathing, and hopeless. And obviously, we understand the correlation between hopelessness, suicide risk, and violence altogether. But these individuals share something which is a very profound and painful loneliness, and in many instances, a painful envy of other people who around them seem happy. And again, those people very often become targets for violence. So, an example of this, and as I said earlier, I would be using names and images in our program, Bobby Crimo. Bobby Crimo was the attacker in the 4th of July attack in Highland Park, Illinois. Dressed himself in a dress and a wig, dressed himself as a woman, went to a rooftop and fired down onto a 4th of July parade in his hometown, doing tremendous damage there. He moved very purposely along the pathway that I described several slides ago. Um, in this, we see something else, again, that I want to bring to the attention of our mental health provider community. One is this idea of the idea of the nihilistic attacker, the belief in nothing, the emptiness, the promotion of creating chaos and destruction. Within this community, there has developed a very specific aesthetic. And this aesthetic you could see here in Crimo's work. First of all, in the picture to the left, it's a day where he's allowed to wear some kind of costume to school. I don't know if it's Halloween or something else. You see a few things. The helmet, the ballistic vest, he has his dog tags on, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the picture all the way to the right side of the screen, here he is at home in his bedroom. You see him again with the ballistic helmet, with the GoPro camera on the top, his dog tags hanging on his mirror. When we look at what we refer to as warning behaviors, this is one known as identification, where he sees himself as this shooter. He has curated this as his persona. And you'll see that in this world, this narrow kind of universe, this is a career path. This is, I am going to become a shooter. In the center, you see a cartoon he had posted online. Notice the details: the vest, the helmet, the camera, the AR style long gun, and him actively involved in a shooting situation. So what we have seen today over and over is this aesthetic becomes more important than the ideology. And this is primarily with younger people. And as I said, just statistically more often male, but not exclusively male, as you'll see. If we look at Salvador Ramos, who was the shooter in Uvalde, Texas, he was known prior to this attack by the nickname of the school shooter. And it wasn't by accident. This was a persona that he had carefully kind of crafted for himself through his vibe, the way he carried himself, the things he was interested in, the things he spoke in, to become kind of his personal brand. It's a fixation on this, as you'll see. And in many instances, it actually starts to take on, the shooting itself takes on an aspect of being performance art, that we do it in a very specific way in these kind of virtual communities, these digital communities that promote this very specific form of violence. Now, Columbine, as I mentioned earlier, is still the most copied mass attack in the United States. And we could see it spill into the current environment. You know, we're just on the anniversaries, you know, the last few days of Columbine. You see in the photograph here, Eric Harris wearing his T-shirt of a band that he was a big fan of. You see Natalie here in Wisconsin earlier this year wearing essentially the same T-shirt as her heroes, the Columbine shooters. And we have had many cases just like this in New Jersey of younger high school students, middle school students who continue to idolize and emulate the Columbine shooters. But the cultural script in that time was something different. And many of you will remember this. It was the person wearing the long black trench coat. It was the that kind of classroom Avenger sort of idea. Today, this has taken a turn, and the new script and the new cultural aesthetic is this tactical look. This image to the right of the screen is not just a placeholder. This is an infographic of all the weapons, body armor, and ammunition that was used by the attacker in the Aurora, Colorado movie theater attack that I mentioned earlier. I also mentioned earlier, this was a struggling PhD college student who had very little money, but over the course of months was able to accumulate tens of thousands of dollars of weapons, ammunition, and other equipment for this attack. So this look becomes the new identity of someone who would be on a pathway towards this sort of violence. Here's Isaiah Williams in summer of 2022 walking out the back door of a Comfort Inn in Phoenix, Arizona. No manifesto, no known ideology, violence for violence sake. Black vest, black helmet, black gun, out the door, more than 200 rounds fired at everything in his way. No specific, purposeful target in this way. Ashley Hale, shooter in Convent Elementary School down in Nashville, this time 2 years ago. Again, the same look, the black tactical vest, two black long guns, the handgun, following the same sort of script, just again, indiscriminately firing everywhere. In that calendar year, we had 5 identical attacks, what we're referring to as self-replicating attacks, based on this aesthetic. If you take nothing else away from this, these are clearly warning behaviors. If we're talking to someone and a parent, a neighbor, a sibling says, my person of concern here, fascinated by this stuff, talks about it, thinks about it, has begun to acquire this equipment, got themselves a vest, got themselves a helmet, just likes to wear this stuff, is a very, very important signal to us. Now, there's some new things here that have really accelerated this specific risk. And that has to do more with our technologies. And one of my undergraduate majors, 100 years ago back at Syracuse was in communications. And back in the 70s, the buzz was in the communications field, this very famous quote from a communications theorist in Canada, Marshall McLuhan. And McLuhan was famous for this statement, the medium is the message. There's a subpart of that quote that doesn't get mentioned that often. And that subpart of the quote is, the technology that communicates changes us. So I want you to look at this image with me. And remember, all the images here have been, I think, very specifically selected for these points. This is Brendan Tarrant going into the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. Look at the point of view. He has thought this through like a movie director. He knows what the angle from his camera on his helmet's going to be, looking at his weapon where he's decorated this black gun with this white writing. This has become now part of the cultural script. He has picked out the music. He has scouted the locations. He is distributing this video and live streaming it at the time he's doing this. He's doing essentially a very low-level Hollywood production here. As I said, not just killing Muslims in the mosque, but this violence is more about, for him, making a movie, making a video of killing Muslims, as I said before, a performative aspect of the violence. Our technologies today give people the ability to do all of that themselves. You don't need a team. You don't need a big budget. You can craft this. And these live stream videos are much, much more powerful than a written manifesto. For a whole nother discussion we could have about that. Very, very powerful as a tool to really, again, elevate the person in their community. And by this, I mean their virtual communities, by coming, again, achieving this kind of sainthood, as it were. So as I said, with Brendan Tarrant, he becomes all of these roles. He fills all of these roles in making this movie. This is Brendan Tarrant as an AI avatar. And here on talkie.ai, you can go and have a conversation with Tarrant. You could select his avatar. You could become a virtual companion with Tarrant and many other actors of this type, many other past shooters, who will speak to you as if you're speaking to Brendan Tarrant, with this mindset, with the attitude, with the belief system, etc. So the technologies that we have increasingly do help people further self-identify in these roles and fortify their vision of themselves as a mass killer, kind of as I said before, as a choice, as a career path, as a form of self-definition, self-identification. Now, the last of these, and although this could be a conversation unto itself, as we start to insert AI more into the conversation. We have a few examples of this. Now, obviously, like all technologies, artificial intelligence, AI, has great potential benefits for us. It also has potential misuses and potential dangers. We have seen AI kind of encouraged, if not facilitated, suicides. This was a case 2 years ago in Belgium. This is a young married guy with children, increasingly gloomy and down about climate and the future on his family, the future on the planet. And in his conversation with his AI companion, and you remember the thing about AI is a learning machine. It's learning you in every interaction and how to relate to you and how to, again, connect with you. His chatbot, Eliza, starts to encourage his suicide as a way to save the planet. He'll be one less consumer, more or less, on the planet. And she at some point says to him, and this is part of the chat log, if you commit suicide, we will live together as one in heaven. He goes on to commit suicide. We have this individual, again, in December of 2021, found on the grounds of Windsor Castle. This is before the death of the Queen over the last few years, there to assassinate the Queen with a crossbow. And this was completely prompted by his interactions with his AI, who he called Sarai. And this guy, struggling with his mental health, believes Sarai was an angel speaking to him and guiding his actions. So we do have this, and Amy brings up about the realism of gaming and all of that, and yeah, all of these things tie together. Again, it's hard to say in a causal way, but all these things tie together. And now we add AI, which is so personal. We've had cases here in Jersey. One case again that we had studied and worked on was a young lady fascinated with the Columbine shooters, has gone home, subscribed to paid a subscription to an AI companion and created her AI companions in the likeness of the Columbine shooters. And again, in her mind, this is a person struggling with her mental health, a person who has expressed an interest in school shootings, a person who has previously had access to firearms in her home, has said essentially that she would die for them. She would do anything for Klebold and Harris, the two Columbine attackers. Now, the thing I want you to say is there are many tools, AI tools online today for free to generate avatars of these prior notorious sorts of shooters. Here is, Klebold and Harris. You can configure them in any way. And you could also go online and you'll notice the subreddit title here of Columbine Killers. This is an online community where you also can get voice samples of these attackers. So your AI is doing three things besides connecting with you at what seems a very real level. It looks like you're talking to Harris and Klebold. It sounds like you're talking to Harris and Klebold. And the way the AI is trained, it's thinking like Harris and Klebold. It would give you the answers in conversations you would expect to hear from these two shooters. If you are struggling with reality testing, if you are having any problems with the boundaries of reality, you being in conversation, you perhaps being a more isolated, lonely individual, connecting at what you believe is a very meaningful personal level with your AI companion, can take you in a potentially dangerous direction. As I said, there are no shortage out there, and I just did this real quick Google search, and this was one of many pages of of the AI or generative AI sites that will create for you these kind of avatars. And then we start to think about digital resurrection. On Gab AI, honestly, you could talk to Hitler. Hitler will talk to you personally the way you would expect Hitler to talk. The ideology, the mindset, the worldview, all of the stuff you expect from Hitler. You can speak to Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden will talk to you as you would expect, with the belief system, with his ideas, with his, again, sort of mindset and philosophy, if you want to connect with this. So we have very, very interesting intersections today where the community technology that communicates with us actually, again, can help shape this behavior. So I want to finish this section and get us to our 10:45 break, 15-minute break, and then we're going to turn that important corner in our program to come back and start talking on the post-shooting side of these events. But I couldn't kind of resist this morning that I have us together to share some of these newer ideas in targeted violence. One that's not new but is changing is radicalization and recruitment. I mentioned earlier, this happens primarily in the privacy of people's home today. It happens 24/7 for people who are on their screens. It happens increasingly for people who are lonely and isolated. And the Surgeon General has spoken about, what he believes is an epidemic of loneliness in the United States, compounded perhaps by the pandemic, driving more people to have their connections with the world in virtual ways than necessarily face to face. We've also known for quite a while that a lot of radicalization to violent ideologies is increasingly happening in these kind of spaces, whether they're the virtual communities I spoke about, kind of the subreddits or Discord servers, places like that, or, in gaming even, and this goes to kind of Amy's question, we do see very specifically extremist recruiters trying to radicalize younger people in these environments. So whether it's first-person shooter game and you're a virtual community playing with a multiplayer game sort of platform, we have younger people, and think about what younger people are about in terms of a stage of life of forming their identity, about a stage of life with neuro and brain development, really, again, being exposed to and being influenced by these kind of thoughts. We know again that younger person, especially who's alone and isolated, unhappy about themselves and what other people think, embarrassed in some way, we talked about the role of humiliation, can feel in these worlds powerful. And then if they advance from the virtual environment to start acquiring weapons, body armor, helmets, that leap, as soon as you start to put that stuff on, you go from feeling powerless to feeling like the most powerful person around. Now, as I said, the good news is most people who become radicalized don't actually mobilize. Radicalization is a shift in attitudes, belief, or thinking, whereas mobilization is a shift in action or behavior. Lots of people radicalize in their thinking. As I said, they form grievances, they develop ideation or violent ideas or ideations, and don't go necessarily past that. But we understand increasingly there's a vulnerable population, and recruiters are skillful in these group games and group online environments to read between the lines and identify people who have these kind of vulnerabilities and may be a target for radicalization. So there's no single good reason that we could say, oh, this is exactly why people become radicalized. But we know, going all the way to where I started our first section this morning, about the environment we're in, which can seem to people, to individuals, being tremendously uncertain, tremendously chaotic, can bring about a need for people to have very polarized thinking, absolutes. And that's what radical thought does for you. It says to you, I have the answer. Come with us, join our movement, join our group, join our philosophy. We know the answer to all the things that are troubling you. Sign on with us. So this process begins, kind of being grooming, maybe exploiting the person in different ways, manipulating the person, exposing them more and more to the line of thought, to images, to materials that lure them into potentially mobilizing and actually taking action. This again from the FBI, a very interesting project which was titled Don't Become a Puppet or Don't Be a Puppet, was all the ways younger people today are being lured into radical thought. Some of this is, as I said, in those Reddit, subreddits, Discord channels, etc., online forums, the virtual community. There is gaming, which Amy mentioned. One is the desensitization to super, realistic sort of first-person shooter environments, the guts, the gore, the violence in those in situations. Again, if it's a multiplayer platform, you don't necessarily know who the other players are. They could present online as being anyone. They could be someone with a very nefarious sort of a motive of being there. In social networks, which are a little bit self-selecting, we tend to join and cultivate our online networks of people who are like-minded. So if someone is trying to recruit individuals, they could tap into a community online of other people who are already somewhat primed for different thoughts of violence. In our apps, whether they're financial apps, they're dating apps, there are all kinds of different apps. Communications within the apps could also be used in this way. And the relatively new thing, again, especially to be vigilant of if you're working in the schools, is what we call journaling or digital burn books. And essentially what this is if you and I open something like a Google document, we all have Chromebooks in school, we open a Google document, I'm communicating with you. You and I are participating in a document. I write something, you write something, we go back and forth. At the end of that, we delete the document, no breadcrumbs. There's no trail of that. It's not like texting, it's not like emailing, it's not like posting online. So in this way, a very covert way for individuals to use some of the products in our normal toolkit for very, very covert sorts of communication. And again, sometimes a journal personally to themselves, sometimes, again, dialoguing with others. But be aware as we close out this section, really of the signs of radicalization. And without reading each of these to you, these should make just really good common sense. The sudden change of behavior, change of friends, change of pattern of life. The individual sounds like they're reading from a prepared script or just repeating the things they're hearing from other people, perhaps in online or other communications. Increased levels of anger, especially of rigidity in their views and attitudes and beliefs, increasingly secretive behavior about what they're doing online. Perhaps if we become aware of them accessing extremist materials or creating artwork, creating writings with those themes. To kind of close this out, I want you to know that in New Jersey over the last few years, as we have had a mandate, a legislative mandate for all schools to have behavioral threat assessment teams, New Jersey has created a three-tiered system known as New Jersey STAT, or the Statewide Threat Assessment Team. How this team operates, and you'll see this in the logo, is kind of a task force model. With ourselves from the Disaster and Terrorism Branch and the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services, partners from the FBI, from Secret Service, state police, education, our child protective agencies, all kinds of partners who play a role in assessing these cases. And it's designed, our system, like our medical trauma system. The level 3, the most accessible of these teams, are in the schools and the communities, mostly at the schools right now. And every school, again, K through 12 public school, mandated to have a behavioral threat assessment team. Level 2 teams are in the county prosecutor's offices, a higher level of awareness, more tools at their disposal. They are, again, people within your prosecutor's office known as the CTCs, formerly known as counterterrorism coordinators, today known as counter threat coordinators. And then the top level team, level 1 team, which meets and is kind of housed at the Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness. But as I said, it's a multi-agency task force sort of program. The level 1 STAT team, which has a direct sort of pathway to the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit when we need it to assess instances and concerns of targeted violence. That is our story for now. We are going to take a 15, 16-minute break, come back at 11 sharp, turn a very important corner in our content, and go completely from the pre-incident scenario to the post-incident scenario, again with the same ideas. What is the role and the function of our mental health response post-mass violence? So I will see all of you in 15 minutes. Thank you very much. See you then. Well, welcome back, everybody. It is 11 or maybe 11:01 by now, and we're going to jump into kind of part 2 of our program, which is the post-incident environment. And we're going to begin at the 0 moment. We're going to think about the actual attack. This is certainly not a pleasant thing to think about, but from the attacker's standpoint, we have to remember that they always have the initial tactical advantage. If we think of the pathway model that we described this morning, obviously, the attacker is prepared, as physically as mentally in that space, as we talked about, to be that that perpetrator of this sort of violence, targeted violence, being that predator, as we described. They are also very often looking to create maximum damage and increasingly create the sort of chaos that I spoke about in terms of these nihilistic sorts of attackers. These are overwhelmingly powerful environments to be in. Unless you are a combat veteran or a police officer who has had significant experience with deadly force encounters, no one is in the state of mental readiness to be in this sort of environment. Ordinary citizens, regular folks, very, very little sort of mental preparation, even if you've practiced a lot of actor shooter drills in your time. This environment is so powerful that it just very much overwhelms really any potential for thinking through the situation. Loud noises, obviously the shots, especially if they're indoor, alarms sometimes going off, screaming, all kinds of things going on. We know that panic is unlikely in most disasters, but actually very, very likely in this sort of event, panic based in part on the perception of limited opportunity for escape, and very often people trying their best to simply get out and get away. And even the incoming police response is very, very overwhelming. Police are going to come in, very, very hard and fast, very loud. Again, from a tactical standpoint, they're not stopping to help the injured. They're moving to find and to stop the target first. People, again, law enforcement coming from all kinds of jurisdictions, all kinds of agencies, and all level of dress, from patrol uniform to plain clothes to tactical gear, and likely to be very aggressive with everyone in the environment as they try to sort out, who is the aggressor in the situation. Bottom line, pretty much everyone is having an overwhelming sort of traumatic experience in these environments. Very, very few people really, again, in a state of mental readiness and physiological readiness to be thrust into this sort of situation. So we get the kind of behavioral response you would imagine during the event. Very much of that is rooted in our physiological response to threat. So, certainly our fight and flight mechanism on steroids, as they say, really, again, overwhelming the capacity for us to do a lot of clear thinking and more or less doing a lot of doing and trying to get ourselves to safety. We know, as I said, everyone's primary response is their own, perhaps their children or their loved ones' safety and survival in these situations. We do have injuries that occur just in the panic of trying to get out, downstairs, escalators, etc., outdoors, and away from this. Harriet's asking, what does LE stand for? It stands for law enforcement. So we're speaking about the police response to the event. When we think about, how we respond to acute stress, as we said earlier, problem solving, decision making, logic, judgment, reasoning, impulse control, verbal processing pretty much go out the window as blood flow is pushed down to the deeper part of the brain. Again, to our fight and flight mechanisms, to our limbic area, to our ANS, autonomic nervous system response, all in the interest of survival, not doing our very best thinking in those kind of moments. We can then, based unfortunately on so many prior events, we can base our anticipation of these events based on videos, both taken from security standpoints, but also increasingly from the shooter standpoint, to have an idea of what these look like from the inside. And in a word, just overwhelming in every sense of this, physically, mentally, and otherwise. We also know that our post-incident response begins immediately, right? So this is not necessarily something where we have the benefit of a lot of time to start initiating post-incident support. Now, obviously, as we're talking about post-incident support today, we are considered second responders. We count on the first responders, law enforcement and others, EMS, to make the situation safe, to care for the wounded, all of those things before we go in. But increasingly, there are models for more rapid sort of response. In the EMS world, emergency medical services. There is a movement in New Jersey and nationwide for what is referred to as Rescue Task Force. Rescue Task Force are small groups of EMTs from our community who have special training, skills, and equipment, meaning ballistic vests and ballistic helmets, to be brought into the warm zone where there's no longer shooting going on, but perhaps the shooter has passed through and we have casualties, to go hands-on and start initiating life-saving care, stopping the bleed as quickly as possible, under the cover of armed police officers. Likewise, we think about initiating our kind of a mental health response as quickly as reasonably and safely possible. So what we know in terms of just general thinking that we could translate from the world of disaster mental health is really that these are some of the most powerful events that a human could go through. They are more powerful, as you will see, as they relate to acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder than many other forms of disaster. So when we have these kind of events, they really shatter all aspects of an individual, sometimes a family, a community's sense of safety, of their ability to, to navigate these events very effectively, especially in the early phases, and that these, again, as the days, weeks go by, again, neurologically as well as just cognitively, start to really take very profound effects on people. When we think about who we will serve, us in a post-incident way, and I know we have people who are in many different roles today online. We have folks who are screeners, and screening has, a response to this, DRCCs, disaster response crisis counselors, private practitioners. All of us have potential roles we could play in a post-incident, hopefully coordinated effort, but we will be seeking to get services to, obviously, the survivors and witnesses of a mass violence event, their loved ones, especially if they've suffered losses, first responders and rescue and recovery workers. And if you think about this, as we, DRCCs, were deployed to the 9/11 attack, obviously a mass violent attack, the early hours and days are rescue, the months after were recovery. Neighbors in the surrounding community, including sometimes schools and businesses, and really anyone in the area at the time this happened who was affected by the event. But as I said, the impact of this is very likely to be serious and long lasting for a very wide circle of people who are exposed to this incident. One of the things that seems to make this more powerful is the presence of what we refer to as dread. And we think about dread, and you see dread not here thrown around loosely as an expression of horror or terror, but really a composite of these 6 different attributes defined by here Amanda Ripley in one of her great books, Unthinkable. When we have events that have a degree of uncontrollability, unfamiliarity, suffering, high degrees of suffering, destruction, unfairness, etc., like little kids were the targets, it magnifies the traumatic impact of these events. So compared to many other kinds of emergencies and disasters, these are certainly some of the worst because of these different dynamics. We can apply some of the general things that we know about disaster mental health to these events, like everyone who experiences these events are affected in some way. Although not everyone is traumatized, no one walks out squeaky clean from this sort of experience. For the most part, people tend to pull together after this sort of crisis as well as other disasters. Stress and grief reactions certainly are common reactions to this uncommon, abnormal sort of event. And for the most part, it's people's own natural resilience that are going to help them really, again, overcome this. People get through these events, obviously, in their own time and on their own terms. But some people will go on to have more severe reactions and actually develop diagnosable conditions by virtue of exposure to these events. But the other things we need to think about in terms of service delivery is this, and it's true in disasters, and it's true in these kind of events as well. And that is that most people do not seek mental health services, but are more likely to actually reject them even when they're offered to them. So we have to be very smart in terms of the delivery of services. because many people are not going to come looking for it, and most people are not going to take advantage of it, kind of not on the immediate hierarchy of needs for many people in the wake of different sorts of events. Likewise, as we think about the traumatic impact of these events, simultaneously, there's both a degree of individual trauma and collective trauma for the community, the school system, the business, the surrounding community, et cetera, that do need to be considered and do need to be addressed. It is not just exclusively a focus on the individual. When we think about this, two useful studies as kind of an anchor point. One was some of the work done by Dr. Fran Norris. And Norris is very famous for meta-analysis, kind of studies of studies. Looked at literally hundreds of studies of trauma as it relates to disasters and emergencies, and found in the wake of shooting events, the majority of people come out with some sort of significant mental health impact, although not all rise to the diagnostic criteria of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the thing we think of most commonly when we think about people being exposed to this kind of powerful event. The bottom point here is probably the one that's most relevant. Well, actually, the second point as well. When we think about natural disasters, the prevalence of PTSD in natural disasters is typically about 11 to 15%. When you look at post-shooting, it's about 10 to 36%. So that's about 2 to 3 times higher. But more importantly, in the last point here, is the majority of people, she says, very few participants report no traumatic or PTSD-like symptoms. So although people may not come out with the full cluster or meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, very few people walk out squeaky clean without some traumatic stress sorts of reactions or symptoms. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, acute stress disorder, again, bearing many of the same clinical features, but the onset of this reaction becoming, fairly immediate. If we look at ASD compared to other sorts of events, storms like hurricanes or typhoons, industrial accidents, violence, assaults, motor vehicle accidents, burns, etc., mass shootings, top those in terms of the prevalence of ASD by, again, 2, 3, 4 times as high. So what we should expect then is the need for services, not necessarily suggesting the demand for services, remembering that most people do not necessarily go looking or asking for, but people who are actually struggling with these kind of symptoms in the wake of these events is very, very significant. So we have to make a very concerted outreach to these places where we know we have people gathered in the wake of these events to be able to initiate those services. Obviously, beyond the immediate effects, there is the potential for very long-term effects of traumatic stress as well. And you can read the slides as easily as I can, so I'm not going to belabor and read this material to you, but a wide range of different health, mental health, and sort of social problems that can ensue. If you haven't seen this, we're here at a very important anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. Just over the last several days. Some of the research actually just released this January from the University of Oklahoma, really looking very, very much at the long-term consequences of the bombing there. Obviously, a mass violence scenario. And much in line with the best-selling book by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, is the idea of the kind of physiological imprint that we bear when we're exposed to this sort of powerful event. The idea that the body remembers the trauma, even though very often cognitively and emotionally, we sometimes compensate and do move on over time. But it does change. And some of the changes were in things like cortisol production, in terms of other endocrine functions, immune level functions, things that really were lasting and do affect health and quality of life over time. And as I said, when we think about how we respond, and we'll get more into the weeds about that in the next few moments, we have to cast a very, very wide net in terms of all kinds of at-risk and vulnerable groups, including those people going into the event, whether it's the immediate active shooting event, clearing those buildings after the event, dealing with the fatalities, which many of them can be, as I said, children, very young children sometimes, which is just incredibly emotionally powerful for responders to be involved in. A number of different groups, including the idea of trickle-down trauma for these responders who bring that home with them and how it affects their family life and their relationships with their partners, with their children, et cetera. All are very, very powerfully impacted by their being exposed to these events. So we do have to think about some of these high-risk groups and think about how response for first responders is different, delivered differently. We have many mechanisms in the state, whether it's our critical incident stress teams, it is folks on our teams who are trained specifically to work with first responder groups. Know that this is kind of a different experience and a different mindset for folks who are going into these environments, being exposed to the threat of life, being exposed to very traumatic and powerful material. We do have to make sure we're reaching out to them as a very specific group. And very often, these are some of the last groups to reach out for help because, again, within these communities, even more of a stigma, more barriers for showing your vulnerability or asking for help after powerful events. But we do need to think about our deployment, right? So this is where we're going to kind of start this discussion more fully. We have had models in our teams, meaning DRCCs and in the Disaster and Terrorism Branch for quite some time for rapid deployment. There's a team I know I've served on for decades now known as RADAR. It is the Rapid Assessment Deployment and Response Team that is deployed to a scene at the request of incident commanders or leaders to help initiate that first mental health presence, be available for responders, help guide decision makers in the likely mental health needs, beginning as soon as possible. So if we think back to the shooting, this domestic extremist shooting in Jersey City at the kosher market in December of 2018, myself and then our branch director at the time, Dr. Adrian Fessler-Belli, we were deployed to that incident during the incident. I mean, shots were done, the shooters were down. But we were there, within an hour or so of the event to help initiate some of the initial deployment of other mental health resources, et cetera. So we always have had a tendency to help initiate some of these early responses. And some of this work in New Jersey goes back decades to models for traumatic, trauma and youth project up in Bergen County, other projects that we've helped initiate to get out to the crime scenes as quickly as possible, where we are allowed, where we're invited. You are all keenly familiar with this idea that we never self-deploy. All right, we never self-deploy to an emergency or disaster. We are considered SUVs, spontaneous, unwanted, or better yet, unaffiliated volunteers. So we wait, but we have mechanisms for rapid deployment in the state, and we do want to get to people as soon as possible. Family unification centers, family assistance centers could be stood up very quickly in the wake of a mass violent event, and we have to understand how to operate in those environments. All of these are multi-agency, multidisciplinary responses in which our knowledge of and working within the incident command system becomes of paramount importance, that we know how to stay in our lane, as I said, and there's going to be a very sophisticated sort of response. Keela is going to speak to you at noontime about the FBI's response. Maureen's going to talk about how we integrate traumatic loss coalition assets into the response, et cetera. But behavioral health, we have some very specific roles. We could be there on the ground. We could be working on hotlines and text lines. We could be working with victims, with survivors, with the responder population. We could be, again, there to be an emotional support or making referrals to a higher level of care if indicated. There's a number of ways. Now, one of the reasons I have this graphic on the slide, if you're not familiar, is the National Disaster Distress Helpline is available obviously to the public in the wake of these events. It's also available to you. So you get home from being deployed to a situation like this, you're really stressed and fired up. You could benefit by someone to talk to, toll-free, confidential, anonymous, 24/7, the disaster hotline, disaster helpline rather, call or text to initiate a conversation with someone who's well-suited and prepared. We can go on scene when we're invited and we're working within proper channels. And the example I gave a few minutes ago is being deployed to the Jersey City shooting on the evening of the Jersey City shooting. We may be supplementing what's being done in the hospitals. If it's an overwhelming event that overwhelms the social work or the care staff in the hospital, We can be in field hospitals if we're going to be on site at a location. We're going to describe the difference between family unification centers and family assistance centers over the next several slides. We could be at schools, community vigils, memorials, funerals, things of this nature. We could be in a wide range of these, and you'll notice that some of these venues can be occurring simultaneously. So we may have our teams dispersed over a pretty wide geographic sort of area. We also know that we have to be synchronized with all these other functions. We think about victim services. When we were working at the Family Assistance Center in the wake of 9/11 at Jersey City, what we did very often was pair a disaster response crisis counselor with a victim service person from our community teams, our county-based teams, from our federal partners, that we would work together as a pair. We had certain things to offer survivors and family members. Our victim service partners had very specific things they could offer, and we worked in a highly coordinated way. If we're working with the medical examiner's office, we may be there to provide support for individuals when they're getting very, very bad news in terms of a death notification, or they're giving what we call anti-mortem information or material to support the death notification or death, victim identification process rather. All of these things are tremendously powerful, and we don't want to put people in roles they're not familiar with and comfortable with. We are typically not the people doing death notification. We have been asked to be part of that, to be there as the emotional support, sometimes with clergy, sometimes with our law enforcement partners and others, when these things are done. Here, I'm borrowing a lot of information that's been shared with me, created with me with some of our partners from FBI Victim Services over the years, Lisa Skolnick, Jill Rourke, and others who we've worked on projects with, who again have been in the field for many of these events, as you'll hear from Keela later as well, for these processes and understand just how powerful they are. Some things to think about is what most people are really seeking in the first hours and days is information. What happened and why and how and all of this. And sometimes, depending on the event, like a bombing event, there are people who are missing. And certainly a very stressful time for folks to not know the whereabouts of their loved ones. Victim identification, all of these, you can imagine, are so powerful. But these are also roles that we can help support. We are usually not the people providing all of this care, such as death notification or basic needs, but we are working with well-established partners who are part of our policies and our programs, our procedures, and some partners we exercise with to make sure people get all of the different things they need and they get the emotional support that accompanies that during what is, and you have to hold on to this frame of mind, for many people, the worst day of their life. And we are meeting people at a very, very difficult time that we do need to be concerned. It is very likely that any of us is searching for the right thing to say. It's beyond words sometimes what's going on. We could exhaust our catalog of compassionate things to say. And I always go back to this idea, paraphrasing Maya Angelou, who had said, and again, paraphrasing, people won't remember what you said. They won't remember what you did. They will remember how you made them feel. Being there, this idea of compassionate presence, being available to them so they're not alone in these moments, is incredibly important. I've had the experience, and this is one very specific, after the TWA Flight 800 crash, where I ran into a family years and years later who I had assisted as part of our work. And they approached me on the street. I think I was in the city, and said, "Are you Steve? Aren't you the counselor, one of the counselors we worked with after the crash?" And this is 10, 12 years after. I said, "Oh yeah, sure, I remember your family, etc." And their message was, it was so important, the things you said and did, that you were there, etc. And I got to tell you, honestly, with the depth of grief of that family, walking away from that experience, I felt like I did nothing for them. I felt like, what could I possibly have done losing their loved ones on that flight? To them, 10 years later, the fact that someone was there for them, nothing was more important. And they remembered that. They remembered me even 10, 12, 15 years after. So this idea of compassionate fatigue, very, very important, or excuse me, compassionate presence rather, very important to our getting ourselves onto these scenes as part of the response. Family unification centers are in the immediate wake of this. And for example, New Jersey schools are, as part of their plans, encouraged to think about family unification. If there's shots fired at school, parents are coming down there. Regardless of what they're told, parents are going to the school. Shooting in the workplace, loved ones are coming to the workplace, regardless of what they're told to stay away. So we know that families are coming, information seeking, trying to find their loved ones, all of this, and we have to have a place to put them, and we have to have a way to support them because it may be hours before they get information. They may not get information, and they may get very, very bad news at the same point that we don't want people alone for. FRCs, Family Unification Centers, are fairly spontaneous and they're short term. They are, as the title suggests, really places to reunite people with their loved ones or information about their loved ones. It is supposed to happen immediately. We've seen this from, a golf course down the street to a building nearby, all kinds of places. And we encourage organizations to think through where they would use, but also how they would staff a family unification center. You just can't pack families in there and leave them unattended. An FAC, Family Assistance Center, is something more formal. It typically is stood up in the hours, days, and sometimes weeks it can go after an event or an incident. In the instance of our 9/11 experience, it went from September 12th until May the following year. You see in the graphic here kind of the timelines, and you see the possibility of both a family unification center and a family assistance center for a brief time overlapping. They are not at the same place. Family unification centers tend to be closer to the incident itself, because that's where people are going and they don't want to be distant. Family Assistance Center, we do want away from the scene because the scene is going to have a lot of reminders. It's going to have a lot of activity. We want the space. We want the privacy to be away from there. And as I said, you see other kind of acronyms on here like the Emergency Operations Center, the Incident Commanders, the IC being the Incident Command Recovery, all of these things simultaneously happening to coordinate this response. At Family Assistance Centers, again, emotions are running very high. These could be people still waiting for news, people who've received tragic news. It's a place that's meant to be a one-stop shop where they don't have to scramble and go to this town for this service and that town for another service. We want everything under one roof so we could serve victims, families, et cetera, holistically in addressing all of their needs. And we'll talk more about those in the next few moments. As I said, not only a one-stop shop, but a place we could do this privately, where we could have a good perimeter, we could keep media at bay. We have officials from the different disciplines who are able to make briefings to family members and others, media briefings when it's appropriate outside of the facility, all these kinds of things to provide, as I said, kind of a wraparound approach to the individual and the family needs. You see kind of a range of services that could be occurring there. One of the things we always need is a child care area that's appropriately staffed with the right kind of folks who have been vetted and, have been approved to be providing care to children, because parents will come sometimes with very little children who they need to, again, keep busy and take care of while they're taking care of so many other very urgent and important sorts of tasks. So in this way, we know that there are roles for our mental health providers all along this pathway, from being there when families are receiving information or providing information. When we mean anti-mortem data collection, that would be something like bringing DNA samples, bringing dental records to the medical examiners, folks to aid in the death notification process. Now, if you're thinking exclusively, as I said, of mass shooting, still there are times where it could be difficult to identify folks after an attack like that. But again, think about how many of these events have combined shooting with bombing or other kinds of attacks in which, identifying victims is going to be a difficult and a prolonged sort of process. Death notification, as I said, We have, obviously, and many of you know this, within the DRCC community, a separate certification for DRCC chaplains, because many people are going to find strength and comfort in speaking to someone from that sort of perspective. All kinds of services that are blended. And one of the things that we do, and we learn this over time, kind of the hard way, we will have in these environments, which you could think of as something like a big school gymnasium or a big auditorium. All of the different services have tables and booths as they were. But for our services to be effective, meaning mental health, we have to get out there and do that active lurking, right? People are not necessarily lining up at the mental health table. So we will have mental health, DRCCs and other providers assigned to these different functions, working to support their personnel, working to support families and others who come to use these services. We're not just all a discrete mental health function. We are going to be distributed to support all of these other operations. And some of us may be on the phones or on text lines as well, depending on the nature of the event. When we think about the Family Assistance Center, there is we have practiced this, we exercise these things. There's plans in place to be able to open these as quickly as possible. And as I said, the medical examiner's office, if you're in a different state, referred to as the coroner's office, is very key in helping to stand this up, to manage this. And a lot of it really has to do with their functions. But there are times when we are simultaneously working with nearby hospitals who have received the wounded, who have family members gathering there, things of this nature. And unfortunately, depending on the nature of the event, as we're, this week in the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, many family members who are missing people and the struggle and the emotions that go along with that, that are very, very difficult. One of the things we use as a model mathematically is trying to anticipate the number of people who are likely to show up at a family assistance center. And roughly, back in the day, again, the old guy in me, we would say anywhere from 3 to 6 people would come per involved person. So if it was a school system, it was some other kind of crisis, and we opened a family assistance center, for every one person we were concerned about who was truly involved with the event, maybe 3 to 6 people. Today it's 10 or more, and primarily it's changes of family and friends has changed our definitions, how we contact each other, how people are quickly tweeting information or texting information, how people become aware of information in real time now through your social media feeds and the electronic devices in your pocket, your purse, on your wrist. We know about these events, and people come running to these places to be with their people, to support their family and friends as they go through these events. So think about this. If you have an event, you have an incident that affected, 50 people, you are now looking at a family assistance center of 500 people, right? So we need big spaces. We need, again, to be working with our law enforcement partners in terms of perimeter control. We need, again, to be thinking about really managing large numbers of people. And essentially, if, in these first days and hours, all people want is information. Now, we don't always have that information. We and our team go through the same briefings at the change of every shift. You'll remember from our incident command terminology, an operational period. We're always caught up. We never speculate. You're not relying on the news and the media for your updates. You want to get this through the proper channels. I spoke a little bit about AI before. The possibility of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, AI-generated sorts of information can really confound the situation. Marie is asking, do they create QR codes to help families? There is a very sophisticated sort of check-in and identification process. So we know who's coming and going, and we know how to connect people with the right information and resources. So yeah, sometimes it uses QR codes, barcodes, other sorts of mechanisms, but there are ways that people usually get wristbands or tags that help us manage the crowds, as it were, and get people the right kind of connections that they need. Family assistance centers very often can stay open 24 hours a day. We need to be prepared for that in terms of staffing. Now, you remember, like any other sort of emergency or crisis, if you're a crisis counselor, our work is very often on a volunteer basis, and you are asked, are you available? Can you stay for the 6 hours, the 8 hours? Can you come on Saturday or Sunday? What's your availability? But one, these can be 24-hour operations, and they also could be long-term. As I said, our Family Assistance Center at Liberty State Park in the wake of 9/11 was open for months, before it began to fold down. So we could be exposed when we start thinking about things like, vicarious stress, secondary traumatic stress, et cetera, to a lot of this for days, weeks, months, sometimes, in terms of the cumulative effect. But as from an operating principle standpoint, it's very important, as the title of the venue says, family assistance. Focus on the families, the loved ones of the individuals who are, at the center of this event. We need to be speaking with one voice, so our interoperability and our connection with all our partners is critical. It's a time when there's the likelihood, as I said, of uncertainty and misinformation. We can't be contributing to that. We do want to be, as I said, compassionate, but also honest, empathic, truthful with families during this time. And families will not have, in most instances, any point of reference of how this goes, of what's going on in the Family Assistance Center, what to expect, what services are there. So you are there very much as a guide for them. And very often we're actually greeting families as they come in. Sometimes with our victims service folks, victim assistance personnel, and others, as I said, in teams of two, meeting and greeting individuals as they come into family assistance centers, helping orient them to what services are there and initiating that initial support for them. One of the things we'll also try to do is accommodate and connect them to other teams who can accommodate different special requests. Maybe that's for hotels, maybe for travel, maybe things that we just can't imagine. Increasingly, we'll have families who may ask for quiet places, for quiet rooms. Maybe we have an individual in the family with autism, or who we really need to decrease stimulation for a number of reasons. So we have to be very flexible in understanding the different needs that individuals and families will bring to us. And at a time when people are really struggling with issues of control and loss of control, all these special needs can feel very, very urgent and very important to them. I'm going to just touch on this for a second because Keela is going to speak a little more about this over her section in just a little while. I've had a chance to work with, over the years, the FBI's rapid deployment teams for victim assistance, providing training for them down in Virginia and Washington area, working with them in different deployments over time. You'll see a wide range of services, whether they're from our counties, from the state, from our federal partners, again, who come with a different set of skills, different resources, different experience, different levels of sophistication, all to add layers onto what we are able to initiate locally. A few things for you to think about, to be aware in the wake of these events. One is convergence. Convergence can be positive or negative, and as it sounds, it's people all flowing into the area. And I'm not just speaking now about the family members. I'm not speaking now just about us as responders, first responders and second responders, like disaster mental health, but tourists, gawkers, rubberneckers, people who just want to go to the scene. And these, again, can muck up operations. It brings a lot of additional people sometimes into an area. It could be perceived as being very insensitive by the community and by people who are involved with this. And we see very often the communities over time start to really get turned off by this and start to push back. But convergence also could be positive. Positive convergence is all the support that rushes in. Our formal first responder and emergency response entities are VOADs, if you're not familiar with the acronym VOAD, Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster, faith-based and community-based groups that they are, all can come together with very specific roles. It's not people in a chaotic way flooding the zone. It is people and teams with very prescribed, practiced sort of roles to fill in the response to these emergencies. So positive convergence are all of our different organizations and personnel who by design we expect to show up and play a clear role. Negative convergence, as I said, emergency and disaster tourists. The media sometimes can quickly start to become unwanted by the community. I very often use this example in Newtown, Connecticut. And it's a bit of a trick question. Do you remember the 1 year anniversary? And the answer should be no, kinda I don't. And that's because the community worked very hard not to have a media presence there during that time. Again, because just the presence and the media interest can start to become and feel very offensive. These are newsworthy events. The media has a right to be there, but just the flood of media into the environment can be overwhelming for these communities and for families. As I said, this is not the first time we see banners hung out after events telling the media, please to pack it up and go home. It could be too much. But this is not the only kind of convergence. We can have VIP visits. In fact, you should count on VIP visits depending on the magnitude of the event. And this could range from, as you see here in these photographs, the president, President Biden, First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, up in Lewiston after the mass shooting there, both at the bowling alley and the bar and grill down the road. These are kind of a two-edged sword. Communities on one hand can feel very supportive from the federal administration and our top national leaders that they've come to mourn, they've come to support the community. They also create an awful lot of disruption because any sort of high-level political visit, celebrity visits, things of this nature, bring a lot of moving parts in terms of security, media, etc., with them, in which sometimes families feel takes the focus off of victims, survivors, families, etc. And also, it's just a lot of logistic coordination with all these agencies and their security needs, etc., when we have VIP visits. But these events are likely to attract VIPs of different levels. Another challenge for communities in the wake of these events is something like donation management. In Newtown, estimated more than 60,000, potentially up to 70,000 teddy bears that were donated from people literally all around the world. Donation management, therefore, can become a real challenge for communities. And in this instance, had to open a warehouse, really again to store and to manage all of those donations. I did mention this idea also flooding the zone is the possibility of spontaneous volunteers coming from all different disciplines, not just mental health, but really people coming, from all over to help. There are questions and comments that are flowing into the chat window. And as I mentioned in my opening comments with housekeeping, we will try to answer some of those after breaks and at the tail end of the program, just to kind of keep our flow going so we can get to our other guest speakers at noontime. So we are trying again to accommodate whatever questions do come into our window. We do anticipate spontaneous volunteers from a number of different places. These can become a challenge for us as other caregivers, sometimes even other mental health professionals who are not necessarily connected to our system, try to insert themselves into these responses. and it can happen in all different places along the line. But there are a number of challenges to us getting to those victims. As I said, one is the natural barrier and stigma to using mental health services. The other is sometimes logistics and so forth. And this is why this needs to be very much a practice plan. When we think about the mental health reactions in the immediate wake of these events, obviously it's going to be very developmentally staged and age appropriate sorts or age specific sort of reactions. With younger kids, if there were to be a word, it would be very often regressive. We can see younger students or younger children start to regress in some ways, become more needy. And it's a difficult time because when a parent perhaps really needs to attend to a lot of other very important functions, they could be, being pulled in a few different directions by a younger child who kind of, again, starts to regress and needs a lot more care at a time when the parent needs more space. This is why family and friends there is important. This is why the child care function becomes so important in part, and why we do have, ways to engage those children. But there's a wide range, again, and remember you have access to these slides to look at later, a wide range of different ways that young children react. School-age children very often tend to somaticize the stress, the trauma, the grief associated with these events. Very often, shame and guilt about what they did or didn't do in the situation, shame and guilt about how they're feeling or not feeling. Very often this gets somaticized, as I said, to headaches, stomach aches, and other problems, and sometimes even reckless behavior. And with older children, especially middle school, high school age sorts of students, we very often can start to see some acting out in different ways. No one really, hopefully, has too much experience in knowing how to process and how to cope with events like this. So there's a wide range of different behaviors that people at different ages and stages do start to engage with that we do have to watch from a mental health standpoint. We also have to be ready when we recognize that people may need referral to a higher level of care. And although we spoke a little bit about children, obviously adults of every age and life stage also are affected profoundly in all different domains of functioning, from eating and sleeping to connecting with others or not connecting, to just experiencing very, very powerful and profound grief and loss and shock very often to these events. So us being there, us having mental health responders in the mix becomes very important for all populations, with some populations like first responders. And if you're not familiar with the term first receivers are those people at the hospital level who are receiving victims coming in, sometimes their family members following. But there's a number of things that make the impact of these events so much worse for people going into the environment. And that's exposure to just so much graphic material, the fear of harm themselves, of walking into places that could be booby-trapped, the fear in the beginning there may be other shooters or other people involved. And again, as I said, sometimes just the wrongness of the event, that it's young child victims, families, things of this nature. Lots of first responders, as you'd imagine, are family people themselves, have young children themselves, are going to have a real sense of connection and identification with victims and their families that just really intensify the sort of reactions that they would have. We've been writing and talking about this for quite some time. In New Jersey, we have a number of mechanisms, as I said, that are geared just for first responders. And we know that, how we engage them, where we engage them, all needs to be very much tailored to the uniqueness of their environment and their work. We do not tend to engage first responders in the same family assistance centers or the same family unification centers as we do the general public or the general population. When we think about interventions, there's a wide range of different mental health interventions that we bring to bear, consistent with what we do in many other kinds of disasters and emergencies as well. And this begins in the immediate phase of the event with skills like psychological first aid, recognizing the prevalence of mental illness, perhaps using even mental health first aid sorts of techniques, and then on to our more formal crisis counseling approaches that could be really used for the days, the weeks, the months to come. Some of this will be informational briefings, and in the family assistance centers, that's a place where this is very common for someone from the incident command system to take the stage a few times during the day and provide people with different updates. Sometimes these are also done outside the facility for press conferences and things of that nature to keep the general public informed. But there's a number of different things, again, that are happening in a coordinated way. And these could be crime victims assistance, community outreach, a debriefing, again, for those first responder communities, and other sorts of education and consultation to groups who could benefit by just knowing how to or understanding how to support those people who've been affected. A good way to conceptualize this is a graphic we use in the FEMA crisis counseling program, in which at the bottom of this graphic, you see the more intense individual services, like you as an individual counselor meeting with one person and spending time alone with them, talking and assisting them with, their reaction and what their needs are. On the high end of this cone, where it's widest, you see what's referred to as low intensity, high volume services. We are meeting or reaching a lot of people at the same time with something like a public service announcement on television or radio, but it's obviously not very personal. And all the other things in between. And my point, as I mentioned earlier, is that all of these may be going on simultaneously. We may be doing individual crisis counseling, referral and assessment in these family assistance centers and other places. And we also may be handing out educational material in public places and making public service announcements all at the same time. We see a wide range of different services on site. Increasingly common in the post-incident scenario are things like therapy dogs. We have a number of teams in New Jersey who are part of the mix. One of the teams I've worked with, a national team, Canine First Responders, that's Spartacus, the Akita, with me and one of our responses, that's Spartacus working, doing his thing after a tragedy in the community. So we do see more and more therapy dogs. One thing I do want to point out to you is these are available to you as well. I know as I left working at Ground Zero each day, I would make time to spend a little bit of time with this one Bernese mountain dog named Max, who I remember very well, as a way just to kind of decompress before I got back in my car and returned to my home and family after what were pretty intense days, kind of at Ground Zero. So know that these things are all there for the public. They're there for responders, including you as a responder to this event. So take advantage of them. As I said, there's a wide range of different disaster behavioral health techniques we bring to bear. A lot of this is just structured problem solving with families who are thinking, what do I do? What do I do next? Where do I go from here? And really could benefit by, just having an anchor in you sitting there, being there with them, talking them through things. Some basic ground rules in our operations. We don't always get quiet, calm places. We want to kind of find venues who are as quiet, as safe, as secure, as private as possible, given the circumstance. All of our models are strength-based models, building upon people's innate strengths. We're not there to assess, diagnose, or treat. We're not there providing therapy, right? Therapy is about creating change in people's lives. This is about preventing change and helping people get back to some level of baseline functioning as quickly as possible. So we're not probing for details. We're not there in a therapy way where we're challenging beliefs and defenses. We're there to support their existing and build upon their existing strengths and coping mechanisms. And again, layering them, adding other resources to them as they are needed. Well, remember, there's no right way or wrong way to deal with events like this. We're there to be good listeners as much as we possibly can. And as I said, we are never pushing people to talk about things that they can't or they won't. We could be there, as I said, as that compassionate presence and do some psychoeducation with people, even when they're not necessarily opening up with us. So we've learned over time that when it's possible, early intervention is very helpful. And that's why we've integrated things like our rapid response teams. We've pushed communities and organizations to think about how to stand up and staff family unification centers as quickly as possible. But we also understand that the early intervention is not all that people are going to need. We really need to give things time. Some other basic ground rules, as I said, ensuring their safety, discouraging them if it needs to be from too much exposure to watching the event on the news and just over kind of stimulating themselves, keeping themselves very aroused, and focusing on things, as I said, like problem solving, connecting with the right supports, doing helpful thinking, etc., and trying to understand the event. Now, granted, all of these things are not happening in the first hours and days. All right, the emotions are going to be too raw. The urgency of the situation is too powerful. So let's think about it in a timeline. The first minutes of the event are all about survival. Basic needs, when we can, providing medical and emotional support, psychological first aid, etc., standing up the Family Unification Center, media management, crisis communications, etc., all in a communicated manner. The early stage for us is going to be the hours to days after the event. And you've seen this many times where spontaneous vigils start to be stood up really again in the hours after the event. Flowers, candles, posters, teddy bears, etc., all there. And we could use some mental health support in those places as well. We like to do this in a coordinated manner so we know where our resources are being deployed and they're done, as I said, in a structured way. The mid phase is in the months to the first year of the event. This is the right time if we're going to do an after action report, the kind of fog of war is lifted and we could focus on the what did we do well, what did we not do well sorts of questions. It's also a time when if there's going to be civil or criminal litigation, it really starts to take off, which means there's going to be a lot of reminders in the media about the case, about the situation. It's going to be ripping off the scab, as it were, for many families as they have to go through this process. And then the late stage is the 1-year anniversary and beyond. And the 1-year anniversary is very, very important. And to us, we still have some of our team members accompany families each year to the 9/11 memorial in September for that anniversary. This becomes a very, very powerful sort of point in people's story and in their life. It's one where we do have mental health support available as well. It's a very critical time. People use it as a milestone for how far they've come or not come. To reassess and kind of sometimes reprioritize their life and their focus. So lots is going on at this time of the anniversary. Anniversary, memorials, celebrations, whatever, are done with the community. They're not done to the community. We don't organize these things, but we will help support, and mobilize resources for them when needed. So again, this could be done in a constructive way. As I said, it's a very powerful time. Sometimes there is a lot of media presence. Sometimes it's done very privately. But it is a time when, again, families are coming back in contact with all of what went on in the first days. And there's a lot of very specific reactions. There's group reactions, community-wide reactions as well that we have to be present to support, because they also could be an at-risk time for people as they're reminded, as they're reliving some of the initial pain from the event. So as I said, this does require advanced preparation from us and something we're doing as part of a system. We're not doing in any way tasked, unto ourselves. And we probably will see in the wake of an event an increase in demand for mental health services as people are reminded. Very often, as I said, people do not reach out or accept mental health services in the first days, weeks, or months, but they do as time goes by, and they see how they're struggling, and their normal coping is not sufficient. One of the things we do want to close with, my closing at least, before I turn the microphone over to Kayla and to Maureen, is the care for yourself. And I've tried to convey this in different ways throughout the program. These are very, very powerful events. And as well as we think about preparing, logistically for these, you do have to think about preparing psychologically for these and to have places in mind and have resources in mind for self-care. Being exposed to the rawness of people's emotions in these early days and hours, the cumulative effect of one story just worse than the next, sometimes feeling frustrated that there's not enough we could say or do to really help people or alleviate their suffering. Sometimes over identification with them, that they were parents, you might be a parent, things of that nature, or even unrealistic sense of trying to make people feel better in this moment, all could erode our own functioning. And if you're familiar with the concept of secondary traumatic stress, very much like secondhand smoke, you're not the smoker, but you're breathing other people's smoke and have an ill effect on you. In this instance, you are not the traumatized person, but being exposed, being immersed in their suffering, we can start taking on some of the same trauma-like reactions of arousal, avoidance, re-experiencing, and somewhat. The way we kind of mitigate this is through three different filters. Self-awareness. Linda just put this up. This idea of taking time. It can be difficult, and that's why we talk about it doing through three filters. If you have a level of self-awareness that you're getting up to your red line where you really need to take a break, please you do. We understand staffing can be low and demand can be high, but if you crash and burn, no good to anybody, right? The second is buddy care, that your teammates hopefully know you well enough that they could recognize if you're beginning to struggle, step in and say, hey, listen, I know you pretty well. You look like you're having a difficult time right now. Why don't we try to take a break, looking out for each other? And lastly, the team supervisors, team leaders who are looking out after small groups of us are looking at what the stress level is like in the environment, but also watching out for individuals and teams, you working with a buddy, who are starting to show the wear and tear of stress. There are things we could do before. Obviously, if you go into these scenarios really depleted and worn down, you're going to be that much more susceptible to secondary traumatic stress. So training, preparing, keeping yourself in good shape physically and emotionally, all are helpful before. During the event, we very often give people shorter shifts, especially if they're working in a very intense environment, like supporting the medical examiner, things of that nature. Shorter shifts, getting you out of there, getting you more breaks, rotating people so we don't overdo it for any one individual. And again, trying to give people really structured breaks. If you have time to eat, try to eat even if you're not hungry. You get time to rest, try to rest even if you're not that tired. We need to be taking care of ourselves before, during, and after. And after sometimes requires a period of decompression. When you come right out of a situation that's this intense and just try to reintegrate with your job, your family, your home life, it could be a real mismatch. The things that you were exposed to, the seriousness of these events, now when you go home to friends and family, the things they're thinking about and speaking about can seem really trivial and sometimes annoying to us. It is a time to give yourself permission and focus on mechanisms that will help you decompress so you can start to plug back in after this. We do this with our teams. It's a good time to focus on self-care. Again, looking out for team members who even after the fact may still be struggling and may actually benefit by referral to a higher level of care themselves. But just because we walk away from the Family Assistance Center doesn't mean we walk away from our team. We need to be in touch with them. We need to be monitoring ourselves and each other's to see if people do require some additional self-care. So you all know the drill. I'm not going to belabor this in terms of self-care, but when you see so much suffering from other people, sometimes it feels a little wrong. Sometimes it feels a little selfish for us to be focused on ourselves. You need to be doing that so that we are not, again, compromising our ability to provide the services or creating harm and damage to ourselves in some ways, which is certainly never our goal. Look out for each other. Look out for people, whether it's survivors or our teammates who start to pull away from each other if they're stressed. It's a natural tendency. We do need to focus on self-care. And I finished today kind of, the last few slides here before we turn it over to Keela and Maureen, paraphrasing this quote from Nietzsche about, fighting monsters and taking care that we do not become monsters ourselves. So by exposing ourselves to so much of pain and suffering from other folks, there is a consequence. You have to anticipate this. You have to prepare for it. You have to find mechanisms for yourself and your teammates. As I said, We know that this is not something we rush into. There's a lot of structure, there's a lot of practice that goes into our plans and our procedures for mobilizing this. It's done to get the best service to victims and families. It's done in ways to protect you as well. It's a way, again, that we could, really balance all the converging dynamics and needs that are occurring. Stay in our lane. Remember the value of compassionate presence. Know your limits. Work with the structure, and be prepared, again, to work with all of our partners, and us being that mental health component. I want to thank you all for being here. For my part, I want to turn